Origin Unexplained.
Hello, you're listening to Origin Unexplained, and this is Sue, and today we're following up with part 2 of these bases that have had like a lot of biological warfare and different things. We're going to go out to Fort Detrick, Maryland in this podcast. Another installation that had a lot of that stuff that hasn't probably been the best for us. Not saying that it didn't start that way, but at any rate. So it was actually named after Frederick Lewis Detrick. He was an Army flight surgeon that served in World War I. And without any further ado, we're off to Fort Detrick in Maryland, a quiet military installation nestled in the rolling landscape of Frederick County. To the average passerby, it appears orderly, sterile, and efficient, a campus of laboratories devoted to research in medical science. However, beneath that sterile surface lies a darker purpose. Since World War II, Fort Detrick has been the beating heart of the United States biological warfare and biodefense programs. It began modestly in 1943 as Camp Detrick, a bacteriological research station created to study infectious diseases and ways to counter them. Over time, it became the headquarters for the U.S. Army Biological Warfare Laboratories, known for testing some of the most lethal pathogens known to humanity, like anthrax, tularemia, botulism, fatigue plague, Q fever, Venezuelan equine encephalitis, and each was like analyzed, cultured, and in some cases weaponized for potential military use. So officially, this work was described as defensive. Unofficially, it was experimentation that blurred the boundaries of science and ethics. Employees have spoke of glass vials filled with spores that could wipe out a city. A city, guys. Aerosol chambers, simulating airborne infection, and underground vaults storing pathogens so viral that a single breach could devastate an entire region. So, over time, several such breaches did occur. And in the 1950s, a civilian worker actually died after exposure to anthrax. Decades later, new leaks and safety violations continued to surface. It's going to happen. In 2019, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention actually temporarily shut down the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick after determining that the contaminant systems were insufficient to prevent contamination. That says a lot. The facility claimed it was due to technical errors with wastewater sterilization, yet history had already shown that contaminant problems were part of its legacy. So, there you have it. Now, during the height of the Cold War, scientists at Fort Detrick were actually studying how diseases could be transmitted through insects. Here we go again. Here we go. Just like Plum Island, right? Through ticks, fleas, and mosquitoes. And I, again, have told people this, that when you're dealing with Lyme and a lot of other things, they're vector-borne illnesses. But at any rate, yes, through ticks, fleas, and mosquitoes. They conducted experiments on vector-borne illnesses, including spirochete bacteria similar to those that cause Lyme disease. Later, many of those same scientists and technicians were transferred to or trained at Plum Island Animal Disease Center, where similar studies continued under the guise of livestock research. It was never a coincidence. It was a continuation. And here we are moving into Kansas, or we are there. Now, one former microbiologist, whose name was withheld in official interviews, recalled, "We were told it was about agriculture. What we were really studying were control mechanisms, how to manipulate transmission, how to contain, and how to observe without being noticed. He spoke of sealed chambers filled with infected insects and of field tests that were classified for life. Classified for life. What does that say, guys? Fort Detrick was also linked to Project 112 in Operation Whitecoat, where human volunteers, many of them Seventh-day Adventists, serving as conscientious objectors, and were exposed to bacterial aerosols to test vaccines and protective gear. Okay, did you all catch that? If you didn't, go back and listen to that. Again, some of these men later developed chronic illnesses. Their testimonies actually describe, long-term neurological problems. Completely understand that. Unexplained fatigue and autoimmune conditions that surfaced years after their service. They told us it was harmless, said one former volunteer decades later. His voice weakened by illness. You hear my voice? They said it was all in the name of defense. Nobody told us what they were really putting into the air. In the 1950s and 1960s, the pathogens studied at Fort Detrick included anthrax, a bacterium that forms spores capable of surviving for decades. When inhaled, it can cause severe respiratory failure and death within days, which we know. It's just... The U.S. military explored how anthrax might be dispersed through the air, how far it could travel, and what dosage would incapacitate or kill. Q fever, yet another favorite of military labs, spreads through aerosolized animal waste and causes high fevers, headaches, and pneumonia-like symptoms. It was prized for its ability to incapacitate troops without necessarily killing them. Tularemia, known as rabbit fever, can infect through a single bacterium and was once considered the perfect battlefield pathogen because it spreads quickly and resists simple treatment. Yeah, So then there was the botulinum toxin, one of the deadliest substances known to man, studied for its potential is both a weapon and a tool for medical application. So every disease that entered those labs carried two possible futures. One for healing, one for harm. As global treaties outlawed offensive biological warfare, Fort Detrick shifted its public mission toward vaccine development and defense research. However, records show that this transition was not a clean break. Of course not, right? Scientists were reassigned, not dismissed. Contracts were rewritten, not erased. Some programs were moved to other facilities, including Plum Island, where animal transmission studies continued under civilian oversight. There were also unconfirmed reports of disease strains leaving Fort Detrick through improper disposal or contaminated waste. And didn't we have that problem with Plum Island? Residents in Frederick County spoke of foul-smelling runoff near the base and unexplained illnesses among animals. One local farmer recalled losing livestock to an aggressive respiratory condition after a chemical fog had drifted over his property in the 70s. Now, no official connection was ever made, though the incident coincided with testing periods, later revealed through declassified documents, yes. A retired nurse from Frederick, interviewed in 2002, remembered treating several cases of high fever and skin lesions among lab workers and nearby residents. We were told not to ask questions, she said. They'd come in with fevers that didn't match anything in the textbooks. They said it was the flu, but it wasn't. The symptoms didn't fit. So I'm going to tell you from my own personal experience As you well know from my last podcast, I told you I have a couple Lyme co-infections of Bartonella, Hensley, and Catana. Okay, where do you get trench fever when you haven't been in the trenches, right? So, when I was younger, I had flu-like symptoms and was told that I had a flu and an infection, and they tested me for mono, and I believe strep throat at the time. Of course, I didn't get tested for Bartonella. Why would that come up, or anything else under those terms of whatever? And I had a high fever, was dizzy, felt like I had the flu, sore throat. My gums had all swollen up, and they were bleeding. If I drank cold water, they would bleed. If I drank warm, hot water, it would bleed. Everything had to be like tepid. And my eyes got all these styes, and they were crusty with, I can't pronounce the word, conjunctivitis or conjunctivitis, whatever. At any rate, moral of the story is my eyes, I had to have eye drops too as well. I was told to rinse my mouth with peroxide a couple times, every time after I ate during the day. I was given antibiotics, and then, after 10 days, well, you're better, everything's good. No, that's not true. You don't just have little bouts of antibiotics and it's gone. So let's get back to this. So they said it was the flu, but it wasn't. The symptoms did not fit. For decades, Fort Detrick operated under a veil of secrecy. Its research justified by the language of national security. Yet every outbreak that emerged in the surrounding regions raised new questions. Why were rare infections appearing near contaminant zones? Why did animals around the facility test positive for strains identical to those in the lab? And why did whistleblowers and local residents reporting these issues face intimidation or silence? So by the 1980s, biological weapons were officially banned. The legacy of Fort Detrick continued through dual use, research studies that could be either defensive or offensive depending on intent. The same skills used to create vaccines could also be used to design pathogens resistant to them. The same data used to study transmission could also reveal how to weaponize it. That ambiguity was intentional. It was intentional. It gave the government plausible deniability, of course. And in time, Fort Detrick's reach extended far beyond its gates. It supplied expertise and material to other labs across the country, including the Centers for Disease Control, the National Institutes of Health, and, of course, Plum Island. It even collaborated with private pharmaceutical companies. Yes, you heard that right. Collaborated with private pharmaceutical companies, blurring the line between military science and medicine. Now, as the stories of Lyme disease spreading across the Northeast gained attention, some researchers quietly revisited old Fort Detrick documents, and they did find reports of tick studies involving spirochetes. And the held tests conducted in the 1950s and cross-references to arthropod-borne bacteria of veterinary and potential military importance. The same terminology appeared later in early Plum Island reports, although no government agency was ever admitted, they never admitted a link. The paper trail remains. Whether intentional or accidental, Fort Detrick was ground zero for research that reshaped the microbial landscape of America. When its workers spoke of the smell of formaldehyde seeping through corridors or the sight of burning animal carcasses in the incinerator, they weren't describing defense. They were describing creation. Creation of something that was never meant to be tamed. Today, Fort Detrick remains active, now home to the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases and numerous biodefense contractors. Official tours show modern labs, smiling scientists, and promises of transparency. Yet Beneath that polished image lies a lineage of secrecy that never truly ended. In nearby neighborhoods, clusters of cancer and rare illnesses continue to raise concern. Groundwater contamination with trichloroethylene. Yeah, imagine that one. And other toxic solvents have been documented. Residents still fight for cleanup and accountability. For many, Fort Detrick is not a symbol of protection. It is a reminder of what happens when science is owned by power. Began as a lab for defense, became a factory for potential weapons, and ended as a shadow that stretches from Maryland to Plum Island, far beyond. The pathogens it studied were invisible, but their consequences were not. The people who lived nearby, the soldiers who volunteered, and the scientists who whispered the truth. They all left fragments of testimony that form a single haunting narrative, actually. Fort Detrick was not just the birthplace of research. It was the birthplace of something far larger, an idea that nature itself could be controlled, altered, and unleashed. And that idea, once set loose, never dies. I'm not pulling this out of thin air, guys. A lot of what you're hearing in this episode comes straight from government and military sources. The U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, right there at Fort Detrick, has published material about their role in studying pathogens like anthrax and Q fever and tularemia and more. Those names weren't guessed. They came right off Fort Detrick's own documentation. Then there's the National Institutes of Health along with the National Center of Biotechnology Information. They've released archived material and studies on Fort Detrick's history, especially from the Cold War era, when it was the headquarters of America's biological weapons research. And if you dig into the U.S. Department of Defense health site, they've got official statements about the human test programs, including something called Operation White Coat. You want to go Google that, guys? Those were real human trials on soldiers and conscientious objectors, volunteers who later developed chronic illness. Their voices are still out there. Some of the darker stories, like the ones from nurses who worked near the base or people who lived in Frederick County and reported strange health problems, well, those came from local press archives like the Frederick News Post and even deeper books like Bitten by Chris Newby. She dives into Fort Detrick, Plum Island, and the diseases that might have leaked out of both. Go look that up. Might be a good read for you if you're into this. Now, Congressman Chris Smith has also gone on record, demanding an investigation into whether Lyme disease and other tick-borne illnesses may have been created or altered at government research labs, which wouldn't be good because there might be a lot of lawsuits, but would you win? Probably not. He has cited the FOIA, which is FOIA, released documents, declassified records, and whistleblower testimony connecting Plum Island back to Fort Detrick. Even Wikipedia, which most people brush off, has citations on stuff like the 1 million lighter test sphere, the massive chamber they use to expose animals to airborne disease, and if you follow the footnotes, those come from the Department of Defense records and military encyclopedias. So if anyone tries to tell you that none of this is documented or that it's just conspiracy, they haven't looked. The paper trail is there. It's been there for decades. You just have to know where to dig and not be afraid of what you're going to find. So, what started as a so-called defense project at Fort Detrick has never truly ended. The name may have changed, the narrative may have softened, but the research never really stopped. The same laboratories that once created aerosols of anthrax and tularemia now claim to be studying vaccines and countermeasures. Maybe they are. Or maybe it's just another rebrand in a long line of scientific cover stories. The truth is, the line between defense and offense was erased a long time ago. From Fort Detrick to Plum Island, the movement of people, pathogens, and classified research formed one continuous operation. An invisible thread running from Maryland's rolling hills to a small island off Long Island Sound. The names on documents repeat, the diseases overlap, and the containment failures never fully disappear. Ask yourself, how many times can a lab lose containment before it's no longer called an accident? Think about that. How many times can a lab lose containment before it's no longer an accident? How many strange outbreaks have to occur downwind from government facilities before we stop calling them coincidences? Somewhere out there right now, a scientist is still walking those hallways at Fort Detrick. Yeah, they're running experiments under the same security clearances, under the same justification for defense. Maybe they believe it, maybe they don't. But the legacy of what began there continues to ripple outward through the air, the soil, the water, and the bodies of those who were never supposed to know. This has been Origin Unexplained, and until next time, stay aware, stay curious, and remember, the most dangerous experiments are the ones that never make it to the light of day. If you have a story you would like told, or you would like to be on a podcast, email us at originunexplained, and that's UNX, no E, PLAINED, @gmail.com.
Origin Unexplained.